Hey man, can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear
All
you.
right.
Hey, Rich.
Excellent. I can hear you too. How's it going?
Wow, it's going great. Good to see you.
You
Dang.
too. You too.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for reaching out. Lovely to hear from you.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on your TED Talk. That's pretty awesome.
Oh, thanks.
I,
Yeah, but
I'd love to know what went into preparing for that. So
oh,
maybe we can talk about that in a minute.
yeah,
Because
sure.
I know that and maybe you're like this and maybe you're not. But if I get a call and I know that I've got something coming up in 6 months, I tell myself I need to start preparing now. But the truth of the matter is, I usually don't start preparing until like a day or two before.
Hmm.
I always
Yeah.
I put things off until it's like super intense and it's like now I can really get my work done. But when you're doing something like that, you really want to pace yourself and really make a plan, practicing your speech. So that's okay. Well, tell me about that. Tell me about that
Yeah.
process, and then we'll get into the details. But I'd love to know your process.
Got you. Yeah, preparing for it. Well, I guess preparing for it was long before I thought about doing it. I guess I saw a need for something in my own life and I tried to fulfill it. And it was actually Rich Redman who 2.5 years ago said, "Man, it sounds like what you're doing is a TED Talk." And
Ah,
I thought he was nuts. I love TED Talks and never thought that was something for me. And then as things kept progressing, Ed Soph's workshop with you was a big one. I saw a lot of what he was talking about related to stuff I was working on. But when I tried to talk to him about it, there was a disconnect there. And I was like, oh, I'm not explaining this very well. Like I know what
okay.
I want to say, but it's not landing with people when I see there's clearly like a connection with others about it. And that's when another friend of mine, Don Henderson, suggested, oh, you should do this TED Fellows, it's called, like sort of a development to be a TED speaker. I never even thought about being a TED speaker. I just knew that the process was really good. It's 16 questions with a list of how many words per question, and it really forces you to kind of dissect what you're
Oh,
doing and
nice.
why is it different? Why are you the person? What led you here? Where are you going with it? And it took me about 2 months to answer those questions. And then that became my application for the TEDx that I landed.
Interesting. So they provide you with an outline of kind of how you might go about doing a 12-minute long presentation or something.
Yeah. The TED
Ah,
Fellows is through TED.com. TEDx are individual, they're institutions that got a license from TED to do TED Talks, and that's what makes them TEDx's. And so it's much harder to do the annual TEDx conference. It's a little more accessible to be a TEDx speaker. It's still, there were about 400 applications for 6 spots at the one that I did. And so it's still competitive, but it's not impossible.
wow,
You
wow.
don't have to be a MacArthur genius or, have 3 PhDs to get it, basically.
You did a great job. I mean, I know it's hard to stand on a stage without a drum set in front of you and present to people. It's hard. It's hard to speak. And you did a great job.
Oh man, thank you.
It felt like you knew what you were saying the whole time, and it was good. So yeah, I think you set the wheels in motion probably from your intention to want people to know about this. I mean, you and I had conversations about this 2 years ago, maybe even longer ago than that. And you're the wheels were turning, and you're trying to organize all these the things into your life and into kind of relating it to drumming and all that. So I think that's probably where when the motion started, right?
Yeah, and it's relatable to you. You're doing something that no one else is doing. And I'm sure you've had to deal with like, okay, how do I fit something no one else is doing into, a system that is already existing? And
Yeah, right. Yeah.
yeah, you found your way with it. I'm sure it was a lot of trial and error and just okay, I know what I am thinking and feeling, but how to relate it to people is a whole nother step that I did not consider when I set out on this journey, how hard it was to put it in terms other people could understand.
Right. And I think the difference between what I started doing and what you're doing is mine's more based on philosophy. I mean, I know there's probably Eastern science related to it, but yours is directly related to scientific stuff. And let's just talk about it. People probably don't even know what we're talking about yet. We've
Yeah.
done all this stuff. So let's go through this in a way that, like, speak to the layman using terminology. So we're going to talk about the vagal nerve,
Mhm.
the vagus nerve. So why don't you talk a little bit about what that is, and then maybe we'll go into your story. We'll figure out how to organize this as we go. But why don't you start talking about? We'll work backwards. So you just did a TED talk on. It's called The Science of Rhythm.
Of the groove.
Science of the Groove. Science of the Groove. Sorry,
Yeah.
I don't have it pulled up right now.
All
And
right.
you basically told your story of a traumatic experience that led you to some deep self discovery over several years, and now you are doing things with, I don't even know how to put it into words. You're merging the science of physiology, namely the nervous system, the vagus nervous system, to health and to drumming. Am I kind of on the right
Yeah.
path?
That's the idea.
Okay, why don't you just talk for a while and I'll just listen. Maybe I'll come
Oh,
up with some
sure.
questions. How do we find the
Yeah.
coffee? Oh, a coffee is being delivered to me.
Oh, sweet. I'm a cup ahead of you.
Oh, good.
Yeah. You asked about the vagus nerve. And according to the research I've been studying, the vagus nerve runs from our reproductive organs to the base of our brain.
Hmm.
And where exactly the vagus nerve ends and the brain begins, it's a cranial nerve, but the impact is more of a system. Like it looks at it more as this relationship between the brain and the vagus nerve, essentially as one thing, and just that conversation that's going on within the system. And so and it's essentially a timeline according to polyvagal theory, the theory I've been studying by Dr. Stephen Porges, that basically the lowest cell in the vagus nerve relates to single-celled organisms 500 million years ago. And as we progress up the vagus nerve, you progress through the evolution of feeling in living things. And so
Oh,
as we get up into the neocortex, that's ultimately how we are now in 2023. That's a very simplified version of how evolution relates to the evolution of the vagus nerve inside of us.
wow. Okay.
So more of a shutdown, simple, like metabolic resources were either on or off in the single-celled organism. And so that's lower. But as we get higher, we get into more activation in the heart and lungs. And then eventually we get into reason and thought and logic in the brain. So that's kind of the idea and how like reason and thought relate to shutting down and activation. Like we want to try to align this whole process in the vagus nerve. That's how the theory looks at our anatomy.
So in the vagus nerve, I talked to Shayna, my wife, a little bit about this right before we talked. I said, give me a quick 5-minute lowdown on the vagus nerve, Shayna, because she knows all about that. And so she quickly kind of ran me through a few things, just enough to be dangerous for me. But
Yoga knows a lot about the vagus nerve.
yeah. And she showed me some exercises to actually help stretch it and align it. But the idea is, if the vagus nerve is out of alignment, would you say alignment, or then it affects the whole body, like it changes
Yeah.
your mentality and
Yeah, well, Kundalini yoga knows a lot about the vagus nerve. Any culture that observed deeply our nervous system and how it reacts
yeah.
understands this internal effect on what we do externally. And so the science is essentially giving a more Western view of how other cultures that didn't have the scientific tools we have now, there's a lot of alignment between the chakras and polyvagal theory. And like the scientific world's like, oh, chakras, that's alternative. That's, that kind of dismisses it. But when I look at that, I'm thinking, well, these modern scientific tools are noticing things we've known as humans for a long time. And that kind of bolsters the impact of it for me.
Right. Yeah. So how are you relating this to your your life now with the way you're approaching music, drumming? Uh, is it a spiritual thing for you as well? Is there some kind of a meditative process in the knowledge that you're using?
Yeah, yeah, it's very integral.
Yeah.
I guess in terms of like talking to drummers, the first thing I would say, the vagus nerve controls our perception of time,
Ah,
which
okay.
that was the big hook for me. I'm like, say what?
Yeah. Okay.
And then I'm like, why the hell are drummers not talking about the vagus nerve? It has a deep impact on how we perceive time. And if you've ever had an experience that was suddenly caused you to notice how time slowed down, typically they tend to be stressful moments. What that is the vagus nerve allowing the brain to make more decisions within a specific amount of time. It shuts down other like digestive, resourcing of the nervous system that's less important. If there's an arrow flying at you, for instance, suddenly it shuts down all other awareness of other metabolic resources and focuses on attention in the moment to make maximum decisions. How do I avoid it? How do I defend it? How do I, react to what's going on? And so our physiological state essentially controls our perception of time. So if time is slowing down on the inside in order to make more decisions in reaction to an external threat, then our external perception of time speeds up. And so that's why drummers rush typically, is because they get activated, some level of stress occurs, and their time slows down, which causes their external awareness of their tempo to increase. So that's
Interesting.
the first relationship between the
Right.
vagus nerve and drumming for me.
Huh. Wow. Yeah, yeah. So now, time also feels internally to slow down when you're in like the zone of playing, right?
Yeah.
Is that relatable, or is that
That's very relatable. That would relate to the window of tolerance. Dr. Siegel, he has this idea. Okay, so we have our upper threshold of tolerance, which is activation, and our lower threshold of tolerance, which is shutdown. And so, if there's a heartbeat, like you say, it goes up and it goes down. And so there's when we're within our window of tolerance, we're releasing biochemicals that support our intention to act. And when we go outside of that window of tolerance, we start releasing excess adrenaline, excess cortisol, stress hormones that force us into this kind of superhuman, like above what we would normally react to a situation. Now, if there's an impending doom moment and we need to either fight or flight from something, we need that. But if we're in a situation where there's not impending doom, and we still exceed our window of tolerance, that's when things go wrong. And so it's really important, I feel, in our practice to establish where is our threshold of tolerance and how do we increase it so that we can have more control over what we're doing, so that we can own our stress responses rather than letting them own us.
okay? What have you discovered in the practice? How do you do that? I mean, how do you start to establish where that threshold is? What defines that?
Yeah, the practice. Okay. First of this gets very into Eastern approaches. I know that Aikido has grounding is very important, like heels on the ground. One of the first feelings of threat that our nervous system has is balance, vestibular response. And so if we're out of balance, we could potentially face plant and mess up this whole structure we have going for us, our body and brain. And I don't think a lot of us are aware of how being out of balance affects our stress responses. And so the first thing I always think of is grounding to the floor. Like imagine being on your toes and picking up something heavy, and then being on your heels and picking up something heavy. You can really ground in, the weight of what you have in your hands that way. And so
Mm-hmm.
balance is really important. I think a lot of drummers balance a lot on their tailbone versus their heels, and that causes back problems and increases our stress response to things because we're not balanced. Our nervous system is being de-resourced.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Okay.
resourcing the nervous system is a big piece to this. We have a series of resources that our nervous system has that cognitively we don't really understand very well, particularly in Western culture. We privilege like resources for the brain, what we understand cognitively, we privilege that over what our nervous system needs. And for drummers, that's a big mistake, I think, for a lot of us.
Right. So the a big buzzword in the maybe in the 80s was ergonomics. Like all of a sudden that word was like how you sold an office chair, or everything was about ergonomics, and that kind of touches into that idea of, it's important that your body be a certain way if you're doing something. And I don't think that we were really paying attention to that much. It's like, well, if I can get the job done, I can get through the pain. But
Yeah.
if we're doing things physically correct, then we're opening up the mental thing, because the nervous system is not having to give so much attention to the other parts.
Hmm.
As you said, we're resourcing more energy, more ability to using our brain if our body is in the correct position. It all relates, right? It's
Yeah.
all one thing. So physically, obviously, drums is such a physical instrument. We want to be grounded on it. We want to be ergonomically correct so our body is in balance. Um, and then what about the tolerance on the time scale? Like, is there a tolerance of that you want to increase? Like after an hour, you're either physically exhausted or you're mentally exhausted from practice. So is it like working out? You just continue to go to the gym, and a little bit your weight increases over time, and you get
Yeah.
strong. You get stronger, so you can do it for longer periods of time.
Yeah, strength is something that our brain would definitely understand. Increased muscle mass means increased ability to influence our environment. We're stronger, we can lift more. But the key for me is understanding how resourcing our nervous system gives us more metabolic resources. And metabolic, not just like, I think a lot of people think of metabolism, food and calories, but oxygen and like there's so many more resources that the nervous system needs that we don't talk about. And so in my talk, I talked about GRACE, which is a great acronym for that: grounding, relaxation, awareness, centering, and energizing. And so
Hmm.
those are 5 resources of the nervous system that I practice all the time. And so because once we pass this threshold that not many of us know where it is in our nervous system, that's an inefficient use of our resources. Like once we pass a certain level of adrenaline and cortisol, things that make us feel good and energize us, and in the moment we might think, oh man, this is great. But underneath the hood, we're burning fuel far more than we should or than we need to, which in the short term could give us a push, and we might elevate us, probably almost also make us rush. But in the long run, it's going to burn us out faster. And if we're professionals and we're expected to maintain a professional level for hours at a time, that's a big deal.
Right. So how do you find that? How do you find where that threshold is for yourself?
There's a number of ways. The breath is really key. The breath relates to the heart. The first thing that I think in terms of something a takeaway from talking about this would be have to do with awareness on the grayscale. So if you're breathing in, your heart rate's going up, and if you're exhaling, your heart rate's going down.
Hmm.
And why that's important is because if you control the ratio of inhale to exhale, you're controlling the rate of your heartbeat. And the rate of your heartbeat affects your physiological state. And if you can control that, you're expanding your window of tolerance. And so it's fairly simple. I like the idea of going up a hill. So if you're going up this hill, you have to breathe in, and then you could take a little bit down, and like a little exhale, and then you go up, and then that's how you go up. And if you want to go down, you do a longer exhale and a quick inhale and a longer exhale. So if you're going up the hill, you're increasing your stress response, increasing your heart rate, which might suit the situation. Or if you want to down regulate, think of yourself going down the hill and having a higher ratio of exhale to inhale. So that's one thing. There are countless ways to affect how we burn our resources in our nervous system, and I've been exploring that for myself for years, and now I feel like I'm at a point that I can help other people with it.
when I use breath in drum mantra exercises, my main reason for doing it is just to give yourself something to concentrate on. I don't think about the scientific part of it. I mean, it's important to breathe, obviously, um, but it's really interesting to hear kind of the science of it. And I kind of approach it from the, like I said, sort of the philosophical. Like if you're focusing on your breath, then you're always aware of what you're doing because you're awake, because you have to pay attention to that. So it's more mental for me, I guess. And obviously it's happening regardless of me knowing or not. The mechanisms of breathing and what it's doing to the heart rate and everything, but that's not where I'm focusing when I do it. And I feel like if I am focusing, like you're saying, it would even deepen the experience even more, right? Because when you're inhaling and you're knowing that you're increasing your heart rate, and when you're exhaling, you knowing you're decreasing your heart rate, then you can kind of start to play with that. Is the goal to play with it and know how to control it, or is the goal to just know that it's happening, be prepared to like know how to breathe when you go into different situations, calm yourself, ramp yourself up through the breath? So knowing those things, it's really interesting to kind of merge that information.
Yeah, I love that you said play. And I love that Einstein said play is the highest form of research. Because if we approach these things from that idea, like I'm just going to play with this and see what's going on down here, I'm not going to apply any judgment to it. And I'm just going to see what happens. So one of my kind of inroads to this was understanding this Bohr effect. I took this breath certification with Oxygen Advantage and learned a lot about the biochemistry and how we move. And I realized that the way we get oxygen into our tissues is by actually decreasing the amount of oxygen in the blood, which seems counterintuitive, but that forces the oxygen out of the blood into your tissues, which is what we need to play drums. And so by actually decreasing the amount of oxygen in the blood, we improve our possibility for higher performance. And so one trick to do that is to just start barely feeling the air come in through your nose. Like just kind of feel whatever hairs are in your nose, kind of move a little bit and just barely feel that. And then that triggers the heart to let the brain know, like, okay, we've had a shift in intake and oxygen, and you'll start to feel your heartbeat deeper. Like right now, we're talking, we're focusing on each other, we're probably not feeling our heartbeat. But if we just took a minute and breathed really slow inward, barely took a breath, suddenly our attention, our heart would start indicating to us, hey, I need some attention here. And that's great for drummers because we tend to be aware of the difference between 80 BPM and 70. And so when you do that and you feel your heart beating, you can be, oh, I'm taking a long inhale. I feel the heartbeat slowly increasing. And then when you get to a maximum capacity of inhale, now let it out and let it be really slow. And the heart's still sending this, letting it know how it's beating. You'll start to feel it decrease. And so then start to think, oh, well, how many BPM has it increased over okay. And so instead of counting seconds, I count heartbeats. So I'll do like 8 heartbeats in and then let it out for 10 heartbeats and then mess with however many heartbeats that and play. Like don't try to achieve or don't end gain it, as Alexander technique would say. Like just play with it. See it's heart rate variability. And the polyvagal term would be respiratory sinus arrhythmia, this change in heartbeat according to inhale versus exhale. And this is a huge deal into our emotional state. Because when we start to understand this, it becomes more conscious. And it's like you were mentioning, like you focus on the breath as a way to focus on it. And this is another way to focus on breath. And all we're doing is trying to make the unconscious more conscious. Or I should say the non-conscious. That's, and I don't want to, there's a form of philosophy and psychology that says unconscious is a certain thing. So it's better to call it non-conscious. We're just not conscious of it. So if we bring consciousness to it, that's improving our ability to increase our tolerance because now we can fortify our muscle tissues with more oxygen this way.
Wow. So the less oxygen in the blood, the more oxygen in the tissue.
Yeah, because
And
that's just the quick science on it. Because the less oxygen, it increases the acidity of the blood, and the acidity releases the oxygen from the hemoglobin into the tissue. So that's what's happening. But the short piece of the equation is the less we breathe, the more oxygen gets into our tissue. But now we do reach a point where you run out of oxygen in the blood and you need to re-oxygenate. And Wim Hof does that. That's hyperoxygenation. But that's like if you hyperventilate, it's not because you're getting too much oxygen in your brain. It's because you got too much oxygen in your blood, and that's made your blood more base level, pH, and won't allow oxygen into your brain, and that's why you hyperventilate. So you need to find, it's the same thing with this window of tolerance. Like you want the low level of oxygen in the blood to be as low as it can go to maximize the oxygenated tissue, but you don't want it to go too low because then you can go into a stress responsive shutdown. And you don't want to over oxygenate the blood in your tolerance because won't give the tissue enough oxygen. So it's all about this window of tolerance. And it's a model that applies to so much time, resources, everything, not too much, not too little.
can you actually sense that? Have you practiced enough to actually know when your body is when the oxygen is in one place but compared to the other?
Yeah. Yeah. You feel it. Yep. It was about the third time I did the practice because you have to develop a tolerance to carbon dioxide. Because if we don't have much tolerance to carbon dioxide, then we want to breathe. And it might not be at the most efficient level. If we increase our tolerance to carbon dioxide, then we can maximize the amount and efficiency of oxygen entering the tissues, which really gives us our optimal performance on the drums to have that. So first level is just to increase your tolerance to carbon dioxide, which are some breathing practices. And what happens is, I remember in the class he was saying you'll start to feel your hands like moisten a little bit. That's because the oxygen's getting into your fine motor skill, into the muscles in your hands, and you'll feel a little bit of saliva build up in your throat. And as I was hearing, I'm like, oh my, that's what's happening. It's like, there it is. And then you don't want too much sweat in the hands or the sticks are going to fly out. So it's all about mitigating this window of tolerance in all systems, really.
Is this something you're doing in more of a meditation environment, or are you actually doing it while playing and turning that into like a focused time while you're actually moving your body?
Yeah, that is the big X factor because
Right.
all these things, like once, doing it while you're not moving, it's much easier to bring things into consciousness. But then slowly, I'll just start tapping heels and palms in eighth notes. And I'll like, okay, now what happened? Okay, had my groove going. I like the talk I did with Ted. I was trying to connect groove as a drummer with groove, with connecting intention and action in anything really. And so like just trying to you get in the groove of not doing anything and then just incrementally increase challenge steps. So just pulsing eighth notes in all four limbs and then stop the pulsing in the heels and just do it in the palms. Now switch to just the heels and stop in the palms. Now that's, any drummer can do that, but maintaining this awareness of the breath while doing that, it gets hard. And
Right.
so you start building your tolerance, your awareness of how much attention can I focus on my breath and my heart and increase the level of challenge I'm performing as a drummer.
Yeah. Wow. I've never thought about it like this. I always thought that breath was a different thing.
This is just one look at it. I mean,
Yeah.
it's because there's another. I think what you're going through, more polyvagal theory would call a homeostatic response. Like you're trying to equal. Like if you breathe equal in and equal out, that can kind of help to lower your anxiety or bring you up from being underregulated. And so that's one way to do it. Another way is to shift the ratio of the breath in order to achieve that.
Sure. Yeah, and I'm not necessarily doing equal in and out.
Uh,
Um, but right, pranayama is the breathing techniques of India, right? That's the word for it. Pranayama, breathing techniques where you're breathing in for, you know, 2 and then out for 8 or whatever, in this nostril, out this nostril, in this
right.
nostril, out this nostril, those kinds of things. So interesting that so much has been developed on concentrating on something that is involuntary or voluntary.
Yeah,
I
autonomic. Yeah,
I love
calling
it.
attention to what was unconscious previously. That's the whole point of it. Because
Right.
that's what I know a lot of musicians talk about, this inferiority complex or imposter syndrome. And it's, well, the way to battle it with traditional methods is mind over matter. You need to focus harder in your brain. And that, from a neurological nervous system perspective, that's completely backwards.
Mm.
Because what's happening, according to the nervous system, if we feel like an imposter, we don't belong in our environment. And that's an automatic stress response. So the first thing to do to know if that's true would be to check, okay, are we in stress? What's our heart rate? How do we feel? What access to movement do I have? First check, just sweep before you mop, like just don't move dirty water around. First, just do a quick sweep. Am I in a place where I even have a vantage point that I can make a logical and, a accurate assessment of something and then make that judgment? Am I an imposter? And most of the time, no, you're not. It's because I mentioned time before. Another thing that the vagus nerve controls is fine motor skills. Because, thousands of years ago when we're stressed, it was because we were in danger. And when we're in danger, we don't need to, play up-tempo jazz.
Right.
Right? There's like a lion in front of us. So immediately we don't need our fine motor skill. So immediately attention is forced to strength and the muscles are activated and tension comes up. We're fist up and it's to defend ourselves. And once you pass even a level past fight, you go into flight, which is an activation to run, which is in the feet. And so it's evolutionarily, there's also gets into coordination, like coordination between the arms and legs had more to do with amphibians, left to right had more to do with lizards, and then cross, right to left and left hand to right foot, that's more mammalian. And so how this all relates to pieces in the vagus nerve or chakras as they stack up, the idea is to stack all of this nervous system business up to the point where the thought can just be dropped into the body and it's executed. And so once all of these things are in alignment, either looking at it from polyvagal theory or from chakras or Aikido has a lot. I really like the soft eyes in Aikido because as mammals, we broadcast our physiological state through our face so that our other mammals will either know we either in an evolutionary way, either we want to mate or fight. We kind of reptiles, you got the eggs, that's fine. You don't need to know that. But as mammals, we need to broadcast each other how we're feeling just for the survival of our species. So there's this heart-face connection. Mm-hmm. And so being very aware to relax the eyes and relax the mouth, that can cue us to be more regulated and less in a stress response.
Right. Speaking of relaxing the eyes, I think are you out of focus all of a sudden? I was just trying to see in my glasses. I think.
Yeah, let me cue
There
that.
you go. I had my eyes checked yesterday, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, can I still see?
And I hope I've been wanting to do this podcast with you for a while. We've known each other since North Texas. I've seen you take something that no one else is doing and create your own unique business out of it and bring it into your playing. And I feel like I'm doing the same thing. I'm just, years behind you. But, but yeah, I really admire what you've been able to do. And it's, yeah, in the TED Talk, I talk about verbal loops, and I totally stole that from mantras. I'm sure you cued in on that.
That was great. Yeah. Yeah. That was a good one. It was a great exercise too. It seemed like a lot of people in the audience they were able to do. I mean, they didn't really show the audience during that period, but you were doing the that do, and it seemed like people were doing that, like
Yeah, I was
two-handed
shocked.
thing instead of just the unison hands.
I tried it out on a bunch of people, and everyone, once I got to level 2, they all kind of stopped. And that's what I was expecting in the talk. But in the talk, everyone kept going. I'm like, oh shit, y'all are rushing like crazy.
I did get to experience that part of it.
And so I
Trying
was
to
like,
hold
oh
them down.
man, I gotta hold this train back. But yeah, and man, it was hard. I was just about to go out there and stand on the red dot, and I'm doing my exercises, and I'm like, I cannot slow my heart down. Like this
Mm.
thought entered my head. If I fuck this up, sorry, if I mess this up, this is a disaster because it's like I hadn't really known another way, a better way to talk about this. I thought I was going to do a drum school, a somatic drummer drum school, and talk about this, but it was hard to explain it to a drummer audience. And Rich Redmond helped me understand this. A bunch of mentors are like, no, TED is pretty much your best option for this because it is a little bit more looking at the nervous system through the lens of drumming rather than looking at drumming through the lens of the nervous system. I kind of had it backwards.
Right.
And so Ted really helped me to, I need to figure out how to explain this to everybody before I explain it to drummers.
This feels like the most clear I've heard you talk about it. In the past when we've had the conversations, I'm holding on for dear life, just trying to really understand, and I'm looking at the diagrams on the web page that you had, and like, I'm not getting this.
Yeah, I felt for so long like the idiot in the room. All the classes I've been taking were mostly with PhD therapists and body workers who were light years ahead of me, and I was just trying to keep up with the language and understanding. And once I felt like I got to a level where, I get this, now I can take this and bring it to my community. And that was my big error was no, now that I know it, I need to completely redimension it in a way to make it understandable.
Right.
Yeah.
And teaching from experience is the best way to do it. So as you gain the experience of how to control these systems and how to observe and understand what's happening, then it's easier to talk about it as well. Because now I feel like I totally get what you're talking about.
Oh, good. And man, thank you for lending your attention to me throughout the years. I know I'd be like, hey, I'm working on this thing. And I really had no idea how to explain it, and that's the big part of the certification I did was Polyvagal Institute. It's like, we know we have something amazing for people. We know how to explain it to scientists and we know it impacts everybody, but we don't know how to tell people. And so they're really, all the coaches and people I've been working with, they're all like, what are you doing? You're like, how do we bring this to people? And I did the first TED talk on polyvagal theory, and because I did kind of get underneath the scientific radar, rather than there's like the quantitative look at polyvagal theory, which, okay, it's like a math equation of the nervous system, and if any little piece of it's wrong, then it's all wrong. And there are certain scientists that look at it that way. Like, there's this argument that because the lungfish has myelinated subdiaphragmatic vagus nerve, that means the whole theory is a waste of time. That's literally like one of their arguments because and to somebody trying to apply it to drums, that's ridiculous. 'Cause from a qualitative perspective, when I apply this model to drumming, I'm like, my life lit up,
Right.
like, so.
Right. How do you approach, how would you fit this into developing not technique and ability, but somehow accessing creativity? Is there, because that's a much more vague, realm. So does this relate? Is there a way to access? My thought would be, like you said earlier, when we believe that our mind is what is the most powerful thing and most important thing to have like in focus the whole time. However, eventually we learn that the mind is kind of responding to the emotion or the nervous system. Like the body knows what it needs, and then it tells the mind, and then the mind goes, let me figure out what to do, boom, and then here's my solution based on who knows what, all the conditioning that your mind has, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But probably,
Who
I like,
knows what exactly?
I like to think of the
Yeah,
mind as, the mind's kind of like the ego, right?
yep.
The mind is the thing that tells everybody, I am this, and you need to, here's how I define myself. But when you can release the need to think about everything, it allows the unconscious, to use that term, to come into focus. It allows the things that are yet unthought of to kind of emerge into our awareness. So how, it seems like it's pretty relatable, but how would you kind of see a practice of doing breathing practice, nerve awareness practice with the intention of developing creativity.
Yeah, the first step would be intention, or kind of bringing about an intention of not judging.
Hmm.
Like the mind is great at applying positive and negative connotations to everything we do.
Right.
And that is the first biggest factor, barrier, stifling factor in creativity. And so that's what's great about the body is there's no judgment in the body. The body is only here to help us. There's no ulterior motive. There's nothing divisive. Our nervous system is 100% supporting what we want to do. That's what it's here for. It is our best friend. And so if we can befriend our best friend and just focus on it and not judge what it's telling us, that I feel like that's the first step. And another really big shift, I like to think of, like, humans used to think that the sun revolved around the earth. That was the level of science we had. And now the level of science then we used to think that the body revolved around the brain. And now that the scientific shift showed us that the earth revolves around the sun, now science has showed us that the mind actually revolves around the body. And so even in the brain, of like brain activity, only 5% is even conscious. So even inside of our brain, we're mostly it's non-conscious, subcortical, science would call it. And so that's just because we're only conscious of what we're conscious of, which means we're 100% conscious of what we're conscious of, And so there's this other 99% that's feeling, that's non-conscious. And so when we can start to tap into that, we really find where our power is and where we're basing what we're doing on our own intention rather than what's external. Because if we're only conscious of what we're currently conscious of, what we're currently conscious of is mostly what's external to us. So once we start dipping inside, we start finding out a lot about ourselves. And that can be uncomfortable. At first, it was super uncomfortable for me when I started somatic experiencing is the therapy that I worked with. And one of the big tenets of it is connecting explicit and implicit memory. So there's emotional memory, memories of feeling that are in the nervous system, and then there are memories of the five senses that are in the brain. And so with mental toughness, how we're socialized, we tend to split those. Like, I'm having a difficult time with something, I need to be mentally tough, and we separate the emotional memory of it from the cognitive. And so when that happens, then there's just kind of this emotional memory swimming around inside of us, which typically shows up as tension. It's typically asymmetrical, and it messes up our drumming. And so in order to become better drummers, we need to reattach why these asymmetrical tension habitual patterns exist, which oftentimes are connected with memories that we struggled with. And that's where it gets very challenging and individual. There's no blanket technique. You go, every single drummer should play German grip because that's the best way to play. No, it completely depends on our nature, our nurture, how tension patterns exist as a result of this lack of connectivity we typically have between cognitive and nervous system memory.
Yeah. Do you think that you would have, the thing that triggered this was your traumatic experience, an accident sort of put you on this path of discovering all this. How do you think you would respond to these things if that had not happened? I know that's a hard question to answer because you don't ever really know, but like if you were just hearing this information, like how would you convince other drummers? How are you gonna get this into their heads without them going, I need this? Because no one knows they need it until they understand it.
Yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, it typically does take some level of empathy with what I did or what happened to me.
Right.
I feel like there's been a lot of folks I've talked about what I'm doing. Like, oh, don't talk about your story. Don't talk about that. Keep it about the technique. And I'm kind of like, well, if I do that, I just sound like a salesman. I was like, hey, I got this new nervous system science. I'm applying it to drums. It's a new commodification. You got to check it out. It sounds like I'm selling something. Right. It's only by talking about how I got here that explains why I'm doing it. And if why I'm doing it resonates with anybody, that's sort of the doorway in. Because, frankly, if you're all hunky dory and your life's a breeze and you had a great, perfect upbringing, these people like that typically need this less. But
Right.
if you are someone who has some tensions and you have some things, there's some thoughts that are nagging you and you have challenges that you don't understand, and rather than taking them personally and thinking that you're damaged or something, reconnecting this cognitive memory with this body's sense of memory is a good first step to figuring out why we feel the way we do.
Hmm. I think it's a great time for all this because so many people are wanting to dig deeper, it feels. Like we've reached a level of superficiality in society. And at the same time, people are talking about deeper things, and we're starting to discover ideas of self-help and improvement on the internal instead of just the external. So
Mm-hmm.
it's a great time to be talking about this, I think, for sure. It would be awesome for you. I know that this is probably going to happen in the upcoming next period of this for you, is to have the system kind of laid out. Like, here's what you do before you even sit down behind the drums. Get this happening, and then when you sit down, here's an exercise. Um,
Yep.
it's not super hard, not super. It's like it's not about drumming now. It's just about moving the body and feeling what's happening inside as you're doing these techniques. And really, it's almost like it's pre-practice. Maybe it's a deal that you or it's its own practice. It's its own system of concentration. You just happen to be sitting behind a drum set when you're doing it. Someone else might be doing it when they're, practicing yoga or, you know, whatever it's obviously this is applicable to everybody, no matter what they do. There's a way to integrate the knowledge because it's really the knowledge. It's happening anyway.
Right.
We
Yeah,
we're
exactly.
either aligned or we're not aligned. You people are either depressed or they're happy, and it all has to do with the fact that you're aligned or you're not. So, but when we become aware of it, it's applicable to everybody who's like, I want to get on a deeper level and find improvement in the way I feel, in my energy, in my sense of being in control of my situation. I mean, it's not like we're ever in control, but the way that we handle the situation is how we control the situation, right?
Oh man, yeah, there's this line from Stephen Porges that still slays me to this day is our the level of lack of awareness between how much we lack awareness of our physiological state is how much we take out our emotions on other people and
Ah,
ourselves. And so, however much that is, that disconnect from our internal emotional state is how much our brain takes the reins and lashes out external or lashes out internally with self-hating language and that kind of thing. And
right.
that really made sense to me. That's where the rubber hits the road, I
Yep.
think, where it ceases to be a model and comes into our lives on the deepest level.
Right.
And what's so awesome about drumming is there's no judgment here. We're just trying to be better drummers. There was a lot of shit I had to dive into with my therapist from my childhood that would have been a lot harder if I didn't have this as the objective. It's like I'm just doing this like self-inquiry stuff to make me a better drummer, and that takes away a lot of the judgment away from it. And
Hmm.
there with this between healing and performance, they're just two sides of the same coin. And the flip is resilience. Like, how resilient are we? How quickly do we heal? How quickly do we bounce back from a challenging professional situation? It's really the same thing. It's how in tune with our metabolic resources, our nervous system resources are we? And so,
Right.
yeah, you brought up warming up. I guess one little piece I'd just like to suggest, rather than warming up our muscles, warming up our attention. Like
Hmm.
how deeply are we attentive to something? Like to be able to be attentive to our heart rate and fluctuate that intentionally with our breath, that takes a lot of attention. And so now how many incremental challenges as a drummer can you lay on top of that before you lose that awareness? So that's a
Right.
great warm up. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, with, in Zen, chop wood, carry water is the idea that you're just always doing what you're doing. You're not thinking about chopping wood while you're carrying water. You're carrying the water.
Yeah.
And that practice, that then anytime that we're able to be in that practice of being, the catchphrase now is being present, but anytime we can, and that's what focusing on the breath for me has always meant, is like, if you have to be here to know that you're breathing. You can't be off in your imagination and still feel your breath and be aware of it. So in that means that anything that we do is a practice for practicing.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
we pay attention while we're making food, while we're washing our hands, everything that we do. And then when we get into the practice room, we're able to be more present. We're able to not check out and just jam. We're actually like working on something. And this also is a practice, which lends itself to it lends itself to all aspects of life, because it requires discipline, it requires
Yeah.
concentration, it requires the idea of sacrificing my time.
Hmm.
Oh man, I don't have time to sit down and really focus on my breath today. Why not? What else are you doing?
Yeah, discipline. I used to think of, oh, if I'm not practicing 8 hours a day, I'm not disciplined. Now I look at discipline as how much am I wasting my attention on my cell phone? Like,
Exactly, right.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
But
Yeah,
then,
there's, man, you brought it up, the key of presence. That's a huge thing for drummers because the heart tells our brain its status 4 times a second. So that's every 250 milliseconds. I think, most levels of people's thoughts of presence is about 250 milliseconds. Like, how much are we aware of that's the most important organ, the brain and the body, their connection. 250 milliseconds to a drummer is a freaking Mack truck. I mean, it's like we're at like 5 milliseconds for a drummer of presence is big. It's like, that's versus what that was still probably 1 or 2 milliseconds separate in terms of flamming. And so there's gets into completing the sensation circuit and the nervous system, like clapping. Okay, what did we just do? We felt something in our right hand, we felt something in our left hand. This message went to our brain, and we also heard the sound. So that's like just clapping is a unison. Now, if you can relate that to a context of time, if you can try to clap with both hands with a metronome equal, and I also clap like this way, so that it's more symmetrical. This is a podcast, people can't see this, right? But symmetrical clapping, essentially, like that is really cueing us in to our nervous system relating to this external sense of time by focusing on what's internal, like really feeling, okay, what do my hands feel like? And if you can clap at 40 BPM with a metronome, it's hard to really sync that up. That's a whole nother level of unison. Now take the hands apart and hit your legs. Is that still a unison with the metronome? Maybe it's a little flamming with your legs. Now relate that, try to feel that unison between your right hand and your left foot. If you can complete that sensation circuit, you don't even need to hear it. You feel it. And so you hear a lot of drummers who are not quite grooving, and it has a lot to do with what is their presence? What is their unison? What kind of tolerance do they have for how big their flams are?
mm-hmm.
And so what I've also been noticing is the more I cue into these different relationships of coordination and making sure my unisons are tight, I hear better. Because rather than the two hands being 5 milliseconds apart, suddenly I'm hearing more space of what's going on around me.
Right.
And I'm like, wow, suddenly this track I'm playing along with sounds different.
Mm-hmm.
After I spent an hour of practicing this unisons with different coordination patterns. So it actually helps us hear better.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's heavy. I've actually, in December, I was just starting to work with different students and applying this. And then that's when University of Mississippi let me know that in 3 months, I would be doing the TED Talk. I'm like, okay, suddenly I don't have time for students. I got to figure this out. So I'm now getting back into doing more, bringing this to students and it's going to be a whole nother process. I mean, I have something to present, but as far as like the formulaic agenda of like how best to work with somebody, I'm still working that out, but it's getting there.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking forward to, is when you develop that little piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, a shout out to Quincy Davis at North Texas. He's been helping me with this.
Oh, cool.
It's been, yeah, it felt really good that he's been interested in it and that he's been actually working out some of the ideas. A real simple one would be to just play all four limbs at once, like in eighth notes, and then now left hand do 3/2. Now shift that to the right hand. Now shift that to the right foot. Now shift that to the left foot. And notice in your shoulders, when you shifted it in your feet, how did that affect your balance? You know, and so rather than just thinking, okay, I checked that box, I'm able to do that, really focus, how did that affect my breath? How did that affect my balance? Now shift it to both hands, do 3/2 over the feet. Now the right side against the left, right hand, left foot. Now left hand, left foot. Now, this is the mammalian one. This is the one that really brings us into our cortex. This is right hand and left foot. 3/2. Now shift to left hand, right foot. And so that's 3/2. And then, do I have it? Oh, I have this whole cycle of 20 different polyrhythmic phrases that you can work out these coordination patterns in all six, and that stacks up. It's the same as the chakras. So like the feet is the core chakra, and you go all the way up to 6. And if you can do all 6, then you just drop the thought of the rhythm from the 7th chakra, from your brain into your body, and you know that everything's worked out in the body, that things are going to be in unison. You can apply whatever you hear to any coordination pattern in the body, and that's when creativity happens for me, is when I have all of this worked out. You know, rather than linear drumming where I think, okay, what's the combination, right, left, foot, right, left? You know, it's like rather focus on what is the right hand doing, and now try to double that. You know, like in a quintuplet, right, left foot, rather than thinking right, left foot, right, left foot, I'm thinking, okay, where's the foot land? And now how if I play all 4 limbs and where the foot lands, now I play 2 limbs and where the foot lands. I call it chaperoning. Like anything you play in one limb, try to play it in another limb, and make sure it's a unison, and then you know that like the kid's not knocking over the Tyrannosaurus Rex in the museum. You know, it's kind of like, just like if you're able to double something in any limb combination, you're sort of, okay, I'm in presence with this. It's unison. Right. It's where I know, it's where I intend it to be. So that's sort of the overarching idea behind a lot of the coordination stuff I'm doing. And so putting it into a framework is where I'm at now.
I have 2 things to say about that. First of all, that reminds me of the Ed Soph at the back of the Ed Soph book, you know, with the half note triplets and then the eighth note triplets, and trying to, and I never did it, but I'm challenging my students to do it a little bit, where you do it and then you just say next, and you have to shift everything to go to the next one. Did you ever do that, where you were shifting from one to the other?
Yeah, and I loved it. That's a great exercise. The piece I feel even more important than the coordination is what's happening in the vagus nerve when you shift.
Right.
And so that has to do with drumming. That has to do with when something suddenly happens. You know, you hear a smash. You know, like first responders. I really want to interview firefighters about this, because like, what do first responders do to make sure that they're within their range of tolerance? You know, like fire drills, that's all about having this huge compression and anxiety in the external world, but able to maintain composure inward. Mm-hmm. And so there's actually a firefighter in the latest certification with Polyvagal Institute. I'm mentoring with them. I'm doing workshops at last weekend of April. I'll be doing workshops at the Polyvagal Center there. And looking forward to that. And there's in this current cohort, there's a firefighter, and I really want to see how she relates to the material. That'll be interesting. And all the people in the class, they're like CEOs of companies, they're breath workers. There are a lot of people. It's really blowing up in European football right now, and people who are in the World Cup. There are a few of the athletic trainers that were working with footballers in Europe, and because like they want to be able to achieve their maximum performance without overexerting, so that by the end of the game they can still be performing at their highest level, but finding that threshold where they're not burning too much resources, but can still perform, and it has a lot to do with their physiology.
Wow.
So I'm just the first drummer or drum set player who's doing it there, but there are some hand drummers. God bless them, but drum set players, I have a little more skin in the game as far as what we expect from our nervous system.
Right. Right. Yeah. The other thing I was going to mention is um, the idea of like doing the exercise that you just did with unisons and then going through the polymetric relationship between each limb. Um, when you're doing that, are you doing it a specific amount of time and then the switch has to happen? Like you're doing 4 bars of 4/4 or 3/4 if we're going to be playing the polymeter, 3 to 4 1, and then it switches, and it has to switch in time, because then you have that anxiety of here it comes, oh my gosh,
Yeah,
it's getting close.
exactly. Yeah, I totally ripped off the system DrumMantra with that. I would totally, yeah, when I would work through your exercises, I noticed, okay, break it down from 8 to 4 to 2.
Hmm.
It's like kind of like compressing it. It increases the anxiety, and that's the same thing I did with what I'm doing. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I just
and
stole that page from you.
and I kind of stole that from Pete Magadini,
Oh, okay.
sort of in a way. I,
Yeah.
I I don't think he ever said it, but he has these. You've probably done some of the stuff out of his poly symbol time book or
Mm.
polyrhythmic thing where you're doing 6/4, and then all the different permutations of stuff in 6/4. And when I was first practicing those things, I would practice one forever, and then I'd practice the next one forever. But the way he has them written out is 2 bars, 2 bars, 2 bars, 2 bars, 2 bars. So it's like, and he never said anything, but I saw those repeat signs, and I thought, oh man, if you have to do it, first of all, it makes it more musical because you're changing. But secondly, you can't just sit on something until you're either comfortable with it or have totally checked out and forgot why you're even there, which is usually what happens on a long exercise if you don't have parameters. So that's kind of where I was like, oh, there needs to be a system to how long you're on something and then how long, and so the drum mantra 8/4 2 1 1 thing kind of came into play. But that was inspired by one lesson I had. I had 2 lessons with Pete Magadini. The first lesson, that's what I discovered. On the second lesson, I went back and I paid him for a third lesson. I said, I'm done, but sometime we'll have a third lesson. And I paid him for it
Ah,
because I'm like, man, I love you. And he was living in Chicago, and I'm like, I need to study with him because Rich Matchalot studied with him. I'm like,
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
need to see what Rich Matchalot was learning when he was, 17. But I said, Pete, I spent 25 hours on 6 measures of music for you. I can't do that. I mean, I was trying to get my first book out, and I felt so bad, but and at the same time, that lesson, I just know that the reason that we were together is because I needed to learn that little thing. Because at first, my exercises were all
Yeah.
about playing something for as long as you can to maybe go into some new mental state, because you're in the zone so much that you lose yourself, kind of the tranced out, you know, concept. And then I realized that's lazy. There needs
Mm.
to be a system. Like, if you're meditating in a Zen, if you're, in a Zen monastery and you're meditating, and as soon as your eyes close, whack,
Ah.
you're going to get hit with a stick, because you're supposed to keep your eyes a little bit open. You're supposed to always look, because
Mhm.
you close your eyes, you go into your mind.
Yeah, one really valuable piece I've found in my practice when I do tune out. I used to feel like, oh, dang it, I was thinking about something I'm doing tomorrow. I failed. And the first thing to do is remove that judgment. It's not
Right.
a failure, it's an opportunity. And so, what's an opportunity with zoning out? When you come back, notice what changed.
Hmm.
every single time I'm like focusing on only executing the action potentials that are the neural transmissions that are necessary to perform what I want. I'm in that zone and I tune out. When I come back, there's always some clutter. There's always some little minute shift that doesn't need to be there. And I was like, okay, at this tempo, in this physiological state, that is my tendency. And now I know that if it's a shoulder or a neck or a face, eyes, mouth, whatever, when you come back from that tuned out moment, that's your dysregulation, wherever it is in your body. Then that's where I focus my attention because that's where my default is. So even tuning out is useful. And so, yeah, when I'm practicing something for a long time, I'll even do it and try to focus as long as I can until I tune out. But when I come back, then I'm like, okay, what just happened? Oh, my left foot came up a little bit. Oh, found you. It's like ghost chasing. There are these ghosts in our body, and we need to find out that perfect lens in the camera that can capture them. And so these tensions come up, and they're not arbitrary. They're ingrained. They're our habits, and that's when we suss out our habits. That's first step in dealing with them.
Do you think any of this will affect, like, if this becomes something that everybody, the majority of drummers now are in it, they get it, they're doing it, everyone's practicing this, we've all evolved to this next level of like understanding. Do you think that will have any reflection on the way that we play drums, the amount of notes that we put in music? Will there be the phenomena of gospel chops and all these things, or will we be more in tune with the music that we just really care about the music itself and not, can I jam in this awesome lick that I've been working on?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
The
I think.
whole point of polyvagal theory is to steer us towards social engagement. Ventral vagal, that's a certain quality of the vagus nerve that's attuned to receiving input and broadcasting and having this interchange. And that's what music is at an extremely high level. And it'll shift. And it's Ian McGilchrist, this brilliant neuroscientist. Well, he calls himself a psychologist, but he brings a lot of different inputs into his understanding of brain lateralization. And he draws a very cogent argument that our right brain is what connects us to our body, and how the left brain reduces everything into tiny, provable facts. And then, the two brains need to work together. But he has this case where he's suggesting that over time, our culture has completely biased towards left brain, towards reducing. And man, everything he talks about is everything that's current in drum, like what's popular with drumming. And he equates it to politics and media, and he shows where it exists there. And I'm using that lens with drumming. I'm like, he talks about one instance, he talks about, okay, well, the left brain reduces everything to individual limbs. Like it kind of makes it mechanical. Like, okay, this limb does that, this limb does that. It reduces this idea of unison, really being present. And I mean, go through Instagram and try to find exercises that have unisons in them. It's
Right,
it's
right.
all linear, this pattern, this limb at this time. And it's exactly what he's saying. That's his evidence of this left brain bias, which ultimately leads to division because we reduce each other to whatever, like classifications of people rather than humans. And it's a huge undertaking to shift this idea that the brain revolves around the body rather than the body around the brain.
Yeah. I have two more questions.
Oh man, I can't believe we've been talking this long already.
It's awesome. I know. So I keep thinking, should we call it, do another one, or should we just end it? This is a philosophical question. Do you feel like everything that happens in life happens for a reason?
No.
Okay.
To us, I think there are things beyond our control that the best we can do is be in the ideal physiological state to receive them. And
Okay.
physiological state is emotional state.
Mm-hmm.
So there's biopsychosocial science, which is what I'm really into. And we don't have control over a lot of what's external to us. And Gabor Mate's latest book and Ian McGilchrist, they all paint this picture that we are headed in a direction that's not good for us. And they have all these markers that are showing the dangers and how a lot of these are really hard to recover from, especially at this stage where we are, which is why I still believe the drummers can save the world. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but when you put all of this nervous system science through drums, it relieves a lot of the judgment about it, about the politics of it, gender, race, and status. Suddenly it's all just drumming. Mm-hmm. And when you look at it that way, it's like, oh, of course this makes drumming better. But then when you try to move it into things that have a little more judgment in them,
right.
It's really challenging. And so I don't think that do they happen for a reason? I think we've reached a point where we really need to bounce back sometime soon. I mean, just environmentally, if there's enough data, scientific data, that we're reaching a point of no return in a lot of ways. And I don't think that's good for us.
Right. No. Yeah, of course. Yeah, I was thinking earlier when you said, and I also agree and read material that supports this, that when you're not in touch with your emotions, I'm paraphrasing, you're projecting them out, right? So you're projecting out what you're not accepting. You're projecting that out on the
yeah.
And I was kind of specifically thinking about your accident. Like, had that accident not happened, would you know any of these things? Would you have become interested in any of these things? Or maybe some other thing would have knocked you into it. Ultimately, you're supposed to be doing this work, and the avenue that happened to get you there just happens to be the one that you experienced. But maybe if that hadn't happened, something else would have happened.
Yeah.
And you're kind of being pulled into your future through all the experiences that you have instead of pushed into your future, in which case everything that happens is just part of what's happening, and it's how we deal with it is the important thing, right?
Yeah. I think the danger is if somebody could justify taking advantage of somebody and just saying, oh, well, everything happens for a reason, I'm going to F you over, But
right.
on that level that you're talking about, I am completely grateful to my accident now, because one of the greatest advantages I feel I have now is who I was before my accident. Because if anything that I feel now, I immediately run it by who I used to be. And if that person approves of it, I am immediately suspicious. Like,
right.
Oh, okay, he likes this. That's what's up with that? Why is that?
Yeah.
So I'm who I was is still in me, and so I can use that as this understanding of something separate from what I believe now that I feel like can help me to connect with people. So
we have these life-changing moments throughout our life, and sometimes it's like a puzzle piece fits into place. It's like all of a sudden, through what you just experienced over the last decade, I don't remember when your accident was, but about that long ago, maybe?
Yeah, May 6, 2010, it happened.
Okay, a little bit more than that. And it put a piece of the puzzle into your puzzle that is a real, substantial, meaningful thing that you will hold on to now forever. It's like it's a supercharger. It's a super positive thing that's come into your experience, where before, the old Adam and the new Adam, the old Adam didn't have that kind of that compass of direction as much, because you're driven by other things. I mean, I know in the TED Talk, and I know how good of a drummer you are, and some people may not know you as a drummer as well who are listening to this podcast or whatever, but I mean, you were awesome when we were at North Texas. The first time I went to your dorm room and you played, I'm like, oh my God, I didn't realize everyone could play at the school. But
likewise,
you're driven to, you were talking about, possibly getting the Wayne Chung gig, and Vinny played on that tune, right?
Yeah, and that singer Jack, he's in the UK. He's like, it's not just what we know about that, but it's a bigger gig than it sounds to Americans. It would have been a stepping stone.
Huge. And any drummer who knows that any gig you get that Vinny played on the record, it's like it's going to be a good gig.
Yeah.
But we're driven by, like, maybe that's your idea was, I'm leaving the Red Elvises, I know you did that for a long time, and I might get this Wang Chung gig, and then it's all going to be right. Like, everything's going to be, my hair's looking right. I got the gig, all these external things, which I just now call superficial.
Hmm.
We try to find our sense of satisfaction through these, like, if I can just get this and this together and this is aligned, then my life is going to be awesome. When I have that gig and everyone knows me in this recording world, but then you have this wake up to this stuff that you're doing now, or things that I've done, or any of us have discovered this really more deep, meaningful things. It's like, oh, this is what's important.
Hmm.
This is what's going to align me. And because it's aligning me, it's going to align the internal me, and it's also going to align the external me. Because if I am no longer projecting out all the stuff that I'm unable to accept, then I find a balance and I find a harmony with how I feel about myself and how I experience the world.
Mm-hmm.
When we're battling things inside ourselves, that's how the world looks to us. It's a battle, it's a challenge, there's judgment, because we're judging ourselves, just like going back to what we were saying earlier. So these things, when they fall into place, it's like, oh, this is a real thing that I'm interested in. This is a real thing that's important and it's meaningful, and it's gonna change lives for the better. The more people that know about something like this, the better the world's gonna be. And when we fall into those things, when we fall into these realizations of these little pieces of knowledge that we know is going to help everybody, then we're on the right path. I've
Yeah.
That's to me one of the compasses for me. It's like, everything I do, I want to make sure that it's going to inspire other people. It's going to be good for the world. It's going to make everybody else want to be the best them they can be. I mean, those things don't come from, I mean, I don't know where they come from, but for me, they come from when I'm more deeply in touch with myself,
Mm-hmm.
something that's deeper, just
Yeah,
like what you're
people.
doing.
Yeah, people feel that. There was a time in my life I would like run this by who I used to be, old Adam, as you called him. I think about, oh, what do you think of auras? It's like, oh, that's some new age, wait, that's whatever alternative, woo woo, was spiritual, blah blah blah. But science completely supports auras. We have a like magnetic field around us. It's about 10 feet. And it was proven in petri dishes with heart cells that these heart cells will beat together even when they're completely separate. And it's it's called entrainment. And so our aura, we are broadcasting on this metaphysical level, to other people what's going on inside of us. And I think back now, I always felt like people could smell the amateur on me. Like I always had this nagging sense, like I was, imposter syndrome. Like somebody just could kind of know that I was good, but not great. And I always felt like the low rent Keith Carlock. Like, he's my favorite drummer. I mean, I freaking adore that guy's playing. And I always felt like, well, I'll take his scraps. Or I always felt like less than. And I felt like I see it now. I was broadcasting that. Like people would feel that from me. And if you're more genuine, I think people feel that.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So interesting that we learn these things so late in life.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. It has to be an education. And that's why I'm really excited about social and emotional learning, which it's based on polyvagal theory. And
Mm-hmm.
polyvagal theory it's a little kind of controversial because people apply quantitative analytics to it and it falls short, but qualitative, it blows up. And so social emotional learning, if you ever hear anything about it in the future, it's completely based in emotional reaction and how being evaluated is a stressor. We respond with stress to evaluation. And
Right.
so, I mean, our whole academic system is stressing students, and there's this school of thought that's, oh, well, they need to toughen them up. And it's like, really? You need to toughen up a first grader? I've had some stuff. I've had 12 years of Catholic school. I've did some therapy for that.
Right.
And it's like, I don't really think that a toughening up model is great for a 6-year-old.
Yeah.
And if that is your model, I would, just suggest try to, seek some alternatives.
Yeah. Did we ever talk about the book? I know we probably should wrap it up, but did we ever talk about the book Transcending the Levels of Consciousness? David
No,
R.
I like it already.
It's one of my favorites. David R. Hawkins is the author. He's written a whole series of books, but this one's called Transcending the Levels of Consciousness. And he talks about uh, just throughout the history of living things, what the level of consciousness is of a single-celled organism, and how
Ooh.
what was required for that single-celled organism consciously to evolve into the next thing, and what mindset and what things do we have to understand to transcend through all these levels of awareness. And you said quantitative and qualitative, and for him you get to this, it's level 4. He's calibrated everything on a level of 0 to 1,000, 0 being like non-living, or 1 being not, the lowest form of life, 1,000 being the highest level of energy that a human body can hold,
Yeah.
which would be like your avatar, your Buddhas, and the top enlightened beings who felt like, who would talk about their bodies feeling like they were being crushed because of the pain, because of the level of consciousness that they've gone into. So the body can't hold any more energy once you get to this level. So anyway, at the level of 400 in his calibration is the intellect, where everything, it's where all the scientists live. Einstein, all the great scientists are in the intellect, and that's the highest level of linear time and linear thinking. So cause and effect,
Mm.
which is quantitative.
Hmm.
I need to see an effect from this, and it needs to be scientific. And then when you transcend beyond that, you go into that's where the cutoff of linear life, non-linear life. And non-linear life becomes this whole other realm of experience, where things are not linear, things are now qualitative, things are experiential, but they're not experiential cause and effect. They're more based on connection, because you go into like,
Mm.
he calls it the intellect, and then the next one would be love, and love meaning the acceptance of someone else, you know where I don't need you to do anything for me to have a sense of love, right?
Mm.
It's non-linear. It's just a way that you see things. And so it's a really amazing book and dissertation of this idea of transcending into each of these different levels. But the quantitative, I'm with you. If something's quantitatively incorrect but qualitatively it has meaning, then it has meaning.
Yeah.
We don't
Yeah.
have it
Yeah.
doesn't all have to be scientifically proven to be
Hmm.
experiential.
Yeah. And I think one place where science gets tripped up on itself is privileging quantitative. Because it's interesting. It says we're trying to remove bias, we're trying to remove thought, we're trying to boil it down to its key point. And it's like, well, the scientific method has a hypothesis. You already have a goal, you already have a vision of what you want. That's a bias. It's like, explain that. So the model that I really like is Bloom's taxonomy, which is an educational model which removes that end goal. It's really, you're just kind of, it's a more qualitative. So you first define it, then you understand it, then you apply it, then you analyze it, then you evaluate, then you create. You create something based on it. And you like, the idea isn't to object, okay, I know what I want to create, I just need to get there. No, what you're going to create is totally open-ended, completely based on the model of your research. And so that's what I've been doing, is basically using Bloom's taxonomy to research polyvagal theory clinically applied to drumming. And that's where I'm at. Because the scientific method is more quantitative, and I tried to use it, and I kept, well, I don't know what the hell my hypothesis is. I have no idea where I'm going. So yeah, it's much better to have it open ended, and you'll get somewhere you want to be more if you don't know where you're going in that sense.
Right. Right. Man, what a great conversation.
Yeah, so cool. Thanks for the invite, Rich. I wanted to talk to you. I mean, you've known this for a long time, and I was like, okay, there's going to be a point where it'll make sense. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I'm glad we made it. I
Yeah.
made
Yeah,
it.
well, it's good. Yeah, I feel like we'll do another one because I love talking about this stuff, and especially when we can get maybe on the drums and maybe do some stuff. That would be cool too. How
Yeah,
can
yeah.
people find you? Are you just regular Adam Gust on Instagram or?
AdamGust.com, AdamGust.com/TED Talk is where you can find my talk. And then there's all of essentially the whole application I submitted, which I'm proudly, third one I applied to, I made it in the first round. They'd like, oh, we know where you've been, we know where you are, we know where you're going, let's do this. And so it's all there. So you can find it there. I also just got listed on TED.com, which is a very cool.
Awesome. Awesome.
Yeah, not
Yeah.
all TEDx's make it to TED.com. So yeah.
And if people
Um,
want to contact you, do they do it through your website or through other social media?
yeah, you can Adam at adamgust.com. Send me an email. Yeah, I'm on Instagram, Adam Gust, Facebook, Adam Gust, YouTube. I'm the non-wrestler Adam Gust.
There's a wrestler.
Yeah, and he's got more views, he's got more subscribers.
Oh
Dang that guy.
man,
No.
you got to do a wrestling video.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, man, thank you so much, Adam. It's funny. Did I write you this morning?
Yeah.
I wrote you this morning. Hey, let's do a podcast sometime. You're like, how about this afternoon?
Yeah, that'd be
Like,
great.
awesome.
I've been wanting to do this for a long time.
Oh, cool.
I definitely didn't want to be like, hey, will you let me? So I
Oh,
very much appreciate the invite. It means a lot to me. Thank you.
do you feel like you were able to kind of say some things that you've been wanting to talk about?
Yeah, I really
Okay.
wanted. It's funny. It was said before. I was thinking, oh, I've always thought, okay, the TED Talk, I always thought of like, I want this to be the tree that I branch out from the rest of my life. I designed it to be like offshoot in a number of ways. And I started thinking, what do I want to go with this? I'm like, man, that's like the opposite of presence,
Right.
So I really just tried to come to this and it's great that we've friends and known each other so long and we've been aware of each other's work so long. This was really the ideal conversation to have post TED.
Cool.
So
Awesome.
yeah, thank
Awesome.
you. Cool, man. This is great. Thanks again. Appreciate it, Rich.
All right. We'll talk soon.
Yeah, you bet. Bye bye.
Cool. Bye bye.